Hello there, and welcome to what is going to be a really weird episode of Weird Music. The album we're looking at today it's a very peculiar album. There's a whole bunch of history, background information that personally I felt is impossible to remove from this album experience. Like if we're going to talk about it, we have to talk about so many different things. So, when deciding to dive into this album, I toyed with the idea of simply listening to the work and interpreting it as I went along, like I usually do with a lot of these, but reading the album description on the Bandcamp page has provided, it's almost an overload of important information and context that I've kind of felt the need to delve deep into what is being said, and I'm going to do my best to interpret and understand it despite having absolutely no academic understanding of music and or art. I imagine my interpretations today is going to be incredibly flawed, most likely wrong, but I'm going to push on regardless. Today I present to you Jubilee by Robert Takahashi Crouch. So the first thing I want to do is do my own overview and understanding of the album itself. So Jubilee is a 2021 release by Robert Takahashi Crouch, a queer-identified biracial musician and composer whose work delves deep into sort of electronic drone music for the most part. Very experimental though, very artistic. Alongside with his partner Yann Novak, there have been countless collaborations between the two, and you can kind of tell that the two really support each other's creative endeavours in the world of experimental and abstract music. And whilst Yann Novak has produced a large number of works across his career, it seems that Robert Crouch has only released a handful of releases, with Jubilee being his latest album release on Lawrence English's record label Room 40. So on Jubilee, we have 3 tracks, and they all contribute to a larger understanding and context of the artist's intention. And we're going to get into that a bit later. Trust me, there's a lot to get through in this video. I would like to just sort of discuss the musical side of things for now, if that's okay. So, Jubilee opens up with the 20-minute track A Ritual, which is an incredibly dark and foreboding musical drone experience that really plays around with the intense low-end recordings. You've got this incredibly powerful bassy rumble that it just fills up the entire room, and it's so dense and heavy. It's like you're listening to it and you get these dense tones that are constantly pushing you down further and further, like you're falling into this murky bog that surrounds you with these heavy, thick layers that, weirdly enough, have this absurdly bizarre physical presence to it. It's so powerful. It feels like you're going to be crushed underneath this phenomenally heavy weight. It's very interesting, and it's a challenging beast of a recording. With it originally being sourced from a 2-hour performance that Crouch performed for his partner Yann Novak. And yeah, I've got to say, being a bit familiar with Crouch's work, this sort of low-end rumble, which, almost similar to Orono and Bachi, I would say, but way more sustained and droned. But yeah, like I said, these low-end drones is something that Crouch does incredibly well. And you'll see it a lot more maybe on his album Subluna, which was his previous release to Jubilee. There's something just so engrossing about what he does. It sucks you in and submerses you in these deep, thick, murky layers that constantly pour more and more and more on top of it. It's wonderful stuff. You can really feel the presence of what you're listening to when you listen to it. And so the album moves on. Moves on to what I would like to call the second half of this album. I don't know if Crouch... I feel like Crouch has intentionally done this, split the album into the first half, a ritual, and then into the second half, which is the last 2 tracks. And the first of those being the short ambient experience of I've Been a Part of Evil Doing. And musically, this track is kind of a bit more lighter and gentler than what is the album's opener. There's something really beautiful about what Crouch has composed here. And it sounds so vastly different from his catalogue of music. Like, usually, from what I've heard, he tends to opt for those abstract low-end drones, but what you've got here on I've Been a Part of Evil Doing is what sounds like more like a conventional ambient track. It's incredibly beautiful, it carries with it this wonderful weight of emotion. It's interesting, it starts off with these musical stutters of notes that are like bum, 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 before it slowly glides into these gentle drones that carry with it that weight, that emotion and power. It's like, the sustain just like really drags everything out. It's really beautiful stuff, and it's very evident that Crouch has been very attentive to the emotion that's coming across in the music on these tracks. And so, moving on to the last track, the second longest on the album at around 11 minutes, you've got the album closer, which is the incredibly emotional and cathartic release of Reconciliation. And this track opens with samples from excerpts from Memorial Day by Ted Berrigan, which is a spoken word passage that is incredibly haunting. This is a very it's very sad and melancholy what he is talking about.
I thought that I had lost the ability to love, so I figured I might as well be dead. I went one night to the top of the Manhattan Bridge, and after a few minutes, I jumped off. But nothing happened. I landed in the water, and I wasn't dead. So I swam ashore and went home and took a bath and went to bed. Nobody even noticed.
A bit difficult for some people, but I feel it's important to talk about these things. We might get into it a bit later. But what it does is it paves the way for what is this incredibly beautiful and glorious ambient track that it just effortlessly drones into this beautiful climax. And you've got that quote providing context of really heavy issues that, like I said, it's not easy for people to talk about these things, but starting a dialogue is very important. And with that though, the music just builds into this really, really big, glorious, celebratory thing, I feel, until it's very gentle and very comforting, and you can feel the power right here, it's right there, it fills you up, it's so beautiful. And there's something very gentle, comforting about it, and it perfectly closes what is this heavy and cathartic drone album experience. You've got all that explosion of majestic power, and then it sort of subsides and fades away into this very beautiful, gentle outro that, I really love this album and this track. It's a really beautiful thing. It's so, what I love as well is at the end of Reconciliation, gentle ambience is just slowly fading in. And then you've got this musical motif that Crouch adds in that it really adds something to that ending. I don't know why, but every time I hear just that little motif come in, I just get it right there, It's so beautiful, melancholy, it's a very good album. It's a very, very good track and very well composed. Just everything. It's so good. And the whole album experience is one that is full of emotion, it's full of power, You've got this movement from Crouch's quintessential low-end drones, especially in the first track, into these incredibly beautiful and haunting ambient passages, and it makes for such an incredible musical experience that carries with it weight and emotion. Since my discovery of Crouch's music, Back when I first started checking out the record labels Line Imprint and Dragon's Eye Recordings, the latter being run by his partner Yann Novak, I found there's something to be incredibly weird and engrossing about the music that Robert Crouch creates. Like, there's something about his body of work that it pulls me in, keeps me held there with this incredible, powerful sustain that runs throughout all his music, and find myself just drifting off peacefully to this very abstract stuff. And yet it feels like on Jubilee that Crouch has really pushed forward his own creative notions, and has produced arguably, in my opinion, one of the most powerful albums in his career so far. Like, there is something truly special about Jubilee. So, alongside the release of this album though, Robert Crouch wrote what comes across as an obtuse open letter to the label owner Lawrence English that is, in his words, forgoes the formal artist statement and instead gives Crouch an opportunity to really delve deep into his process, his mindset, and his personal understanding of the work he is presenting. It's an incredibly lengthy yet fascinating piece that adds so much context to this album that it seems to reshape it into something different after you've heard it. Like, you can listen to this album without reading it. You can get across all that emotion, your interpretations of it, how it's making you feel here. And then you read all these liner notes, you get all this history, this context and understanding that it completely reshifts your understanding into something different that, you know, it's very peculiar. Like, and hence why I think we've got to go deep into this one. Like, this is going to be probably the longest and most inaccessible episode of Weird Music to date. But you know what? It's fine. Like, what we're going to do is, I'm going all in. I'm going to be reading the entire text provided with this album. We're going to have the original album underscoring it as well. It's going to be a bit peculiar, but I think when you hear what Robert Crouch has to say about this album, I think it's going to make sense why we have to talk about it. It's incredibly important. I'm then going to go into my interpretation of what I think he's trying to express in this text. So, if you want to, feel free to skip ahead just to the explanation. If maybe you've already read this, it's entirely up to you. I do think the text is incredibly important in providing an understanding of the larger context here, so hence why we're going into it. But it's entirely up to you if you want to watch this. Lawrence, I hope you don't mind, but in lieu of a formal artist statement, I thought it might be interesting just to speak to you, obtusely, about what I was thinking when composing work for Jubilee, my new Room 40 release. I appreciate how you've supported my work for a couple of years now. Hopefully this will shed some light on why it takes me so long to finish and why it has taken this aesthetic and conceptual turn. I've broken this letter into 2 parts with the hope that they, along with the music, can serve as fragments of a larger text. Perhaps there might be an opportunity for something useful here. Best, Robert. Number 1. Abstract sound is a bad idea for good things. Okay, what I really meant to say is that abstract sound, in this case instrumental or non-vocal electronic music, is not terribly effective at communicating complex ideas. This isn't intended to be polemical, and it's not to denigrate the intellectual processes and theories embedded in the histories of music and organized sound. Rather, I just want to posit that objectively abstract sound can only present the formal qualities of itself as it is heard. I can't tell you much beyond that with certainty. The timbral, rhythmic, harmonic and melodic information, yes, that's there. But without context, what else can we know? Sure, we've talked at length about Luke Ferrari's contribution to music concrete, field recording and active listening as a kind of creative expression. But take the sounds heard in Presque Rien. Stripped of context, they're arguably meaningless. Of course, we know this not to be true. Even still, I just want to point out that our understanding of the complexities of that piece doesn't come strictly from consuming the work itself. It comes from the texts that precede and inform our listening experience. Obviously, an artwork is rarely presented without some context. Press releases, gallery text, music reviews, and blogs abound, and there's an entire industry devoted to contextualizing, packaging, and unpacking art that is practically unavoidable. However, for the moment, I would like to just pull apart the work itself. I'd like to isolate it from the critical and pedagogical apparatus in which it is usually bound. Maybe I should back up. I should acknowledge that my process is informed by several years of art school training in a conceptual post-studio tradition. This background frequently comes back to slap me down. It's the voice in my head that suggests the work alone can't be separated from context, history, or a listener's subjectivity. Post-structuralist theory suggests that the reader is always an active participant in the construction of meaning. This idea is something I've always considered when making work, that at best, what I can do is provoke some engagement or appreciation with a listener. Well, here's the problem with that. As I've moved away from making installations, sculptural work and photography towards abstract sound, these provocations work differently, if not fail altogether in the art of post-structuralism. An exhibition, which, let's agree, is analogous to an album, can create a much more complex choreography of understanding. Its organization dictates where the audience stands, how they move through a space, what didactic materials are integrated, etc. Of course, it's entirely possible to view visual art outside of a thoughtful, curated context, usually through social media. But when was that the last time you experienced a Bruce Norman installation on a Spotify, or to be fair, YouTube playlist? The current industry has standardized the way we consume music as a decontextualized, dematerialized listening experience. You could argue that listening to a playlist is not much different than listening to a radio show, but at least with radio there's an opportunity for a DJ to talk about the music and the artist. Don't get me wrong, I love it when my work shows up on someone's playlist, meaning that someone put the effort to promote my music. But at the same time, these playlists never consider the artist's intention. Even the most subtle or contextually dependent artwork can become misrepresented by its conclusion in Now But That's What I Call Ambient Volume 24. This is all to ask, what can be communicated in my chosen medium? How can I do this? And where or what is the porous boundary between my authorship and the listener's agency? As a maker of things, these are just some of the considerations I grapple with constantly. Number 2, people like me. In 2006, Montreal band The Deers released their third studio album, Gang of Losers. I began listening to them the following year for a couple of reasons. Firstly, I was intrigued when I read that the singer Murray Lightburn was being described as the Black Morrissey. I found this interesting as I had been a fan of the Smiths since high school. Yet at the same time, I found it irksome that this talented musician Lightburn was being reduced to a radicalized copy of a more prominent white artist. At least this was before Moz became the publicly reviled troll he is now. My understanding of the Deers is preceded by the underscoring of Light's blackness. I've never seen a photo of the band and would have been otherwise remained unaware of his race in those first late night listening to Ticket to Immortality or I Fell Deep had it not been for those reviews. The second, and more prominent reason I began listening to the Deers was because I was getting out of a pretty bad relationship, one that I won't go into details here. I was quite gutted by the experience and spent a lot of time driving from Los Angeles to San Francisco to spend time with old friends and to recover. That period was also marked by some other major life events: spinal surgery, and a corresponding opioid dependency. Yep, I was part of the American opioid zeitgeist. A failed affair, and 2 suicide attempts by people I was very close with. One successful, the other thankfully not. I was raw. Part of my healing ritual was to take these spontaneous drives up the 5 and crash land once I got to SF. I had lived there for several years in the 90s, and it felt a bit more like home. Like the place where I had once learned how to be a better person. Music played a big part in this recovery process. I'm not too embarrassed to admit that when alone in the car, I belt out a few Rufus Wainwright tunes to help pass the time. When the Deers released the EP You and I Are a Gang of Losers, it found a place of high rotation in my road trip playlist, alongside the previously mentioned album. One track stood out in particular, People Like Us, became an unexpected personal anthem in which I found solace and solidarity in Lightburn's lyrics. I was told that you were all accustomed to people like us. You see, genocide is slow and relentless for people like us. I couldn't help but read People Like Us through Lightburn's blackness and overlay my own subjectivity in an attempt at a moment of solidarity. As a queer-identified biracial person, I felt included in the titular us. For those moments, it was as if Lightburn was speaking, singing for me. And at the top of my lungs, clumsily, I would reciprocate. In the track, Lightburn articulates the experience of living under the thumb of dominant culture, with the presence of violence made manifest. I just wanted to go back home, but it's been torn down. I've been needing to get revenge, but it's been too long. Powerless our lungs have been rendered. It may be punctured, so I surrendered. However, it's what happened in the bridge that continues to hold my attention after all this time. Halfway through the song, Lightburn belts out, "Yes, I've done shit, I've been part of evil doing," in what I understood as a stunning reversal of empathy. In that moment, we're also being asked to consider the subject of the song as an active agent of their own undoing, perhaps even guilty of violence themselves. When People Like Us would come during those late night emergency drives to San Francisco, it was that bridge I looked most forward to singing. And I would sing as loudly as I could, to the point of getting choked up with tears, every single time. Even now, when I listen to that track, I get goosebumps at the bridge. I found catharsis in that moment where Lightburn's reversal opened a space in which I could begin to not only heal, but to also enter a process that required an admission of guilt. In that space, I could acknowledge my own culpability in the various messes that were starting to define me at that time in my life. For me, contrition became a necessary step in my own recovery, regardless of how much I felt victimized by abusive people or physically struggled with injury and medication. In my life, I felt the sting of emotional abuse, racism, classism, and homophobia. I've had people throw bottles at me and my boyfriend from moving cars. I've been beaten and left unconscious in a parking lot at 2 a.m. I've also done some really fucked up shit too. They're things I don't want to mention or to speak about, but I've done them. But those transgressions do not negate my experiences as a victim of abuse, nor do those traumatic experiences undo the horrible things I've done. And as we grow older, there are fewer people left to forgive, or whom to ask for forgiveness. So, yeah, I'm hoping if you listen to it all or read it all, you kind of understand why I felt it's very important to talk about this text. And I'm going to try sort of delve into my understanding what I think he's trying to talk about. Going first into part one, abstract sounds a bad idea for good ideas, and then into People Like Us, the second part. So in that first part, I believe Robert Crouch posits the theory that abstract sounds, which in this case is electronic instrumental non-vocal music, is inherently flawed at the communication of larger, more complex ideas. That, in of itself, all this style of music can do is present exactly what it is itself, and that you as the listener are hearing it, and that without context, what can we know? And he uses the work of Luc Ferrari as an example, a classic music concrete composer who encouraged active listening. And Crouch used his work Prazik Ring as an example in explaining that without a context preceding the work itself, the sounds on the recording or any recording itself are largely meaningless. That consuming the work itself doesn't give you an understanding of its complexities, but you also need to understand the texts that precede the work itself. Like, they all link into each other, they all help provide artist's intention and things. He goes on to explain that artwork is usually presented with extra information following its release that help add context and understanding to the work, and that there's an entire industry dedicated to trying to understand art, dedicated to listeners trying to understand it and present their own theories and ideas on art and artwork. And believe me, the irony is not lost on me. I'm very well aware of the ironic element here, but regardless, I really want to get into this album, I really want to discuss this. Crouch then goes on to explain in detail that his background in art school has informed his own process in composition and construction of his artwork, which for himself provides his own understanding and context of the work, including the fact that the art itself can't really be separated from context, history, or even the listener's subjectivity. That we as consumers of the media, we become active participants in how the meaning of the work is constructed and, generally always have been. Crouch then seems to discuss the exhibition of artwork and how the current music industry and the way we as listeners consume media has completely changed original concepts and context of understanding, and arguably how we appreciate art and approach it. And it seems in this current era of online music streaming that there's little space for the original context, that especially with the presentation of music playlists on like Spotify and YouTube, all it's doing is lumping together similar sounding music in a way to easily consume it all with a single press of a button. And whilst it's nice to have your artwork represented in this way, especially if you're a creator of the music that's being included on, it largely in effect fails to express an artist's original intention because you're decontextualizing it, you're taking it apart from the whole, I suppose. And so with this understanding of how Crouch creates his art and how listeners probably will consume his art, he's pondering the question of what it is he can communicate with this chosen medium. Because there's so many flaws with it anyway, from the actual musical side of it to even now how the art's consumed and stuff. And it seems his own work is marred by considerations of his own involvement in the work itself, the context and understanding that is provided by the listener's own agency. And he's positing questions like, is there an overlap between the two of these? Are those two things really far apart? And I imagine it differs from person to person depending on how they've consumed the media, what they know to understand of it, what they interpret of it, what even as well they inherently feel of it, like right here, like your natural initial reactions. This all shapes the context and understanding of artwork. And yeah, I think Crouch is just sort of positing the theory that it's all a bit messy and flawed really, especially in these modern days. And then the second paragraph, people like me. And in this second paragraph, Crouch seems to direct his gaze away from the art and instead look within himself for context and understanding. And he does this first by discussing the Montreal-based band The Deers, and in particular their album Gang of Losers, going into detail about his discovery of the band, his understanding of their music, which was mostly marred by the fact that so many reviewers described the lead singer Murray Lightburn as the Black Morrissey. And a comparison which, whilst makes sense to reviewers of music in presenting a context for new listeners, it will ultimately undermine their understanding of the music by the simple fact itself, rather than letting the music itself provide its own context. Also ask yourself, why does a talented black artist need to be compared with a prominent white one? It's very peculiar stuff, and I feel, especially given Robert Crouch's biracial background, there's a lot he sees in this. Like, this is something very important to him. This is, something that I myself, based on, my upbringing, privilege, and just natural self, can't really understand properly, and, that's fine, but it's important to start dialogues and, discuss these things. Why does this man need to be compared to Morrissey? Like, surely his talents as a songwriter, musician, singer, that should be the context we need. And moving on, though. Crouch then goes on to explain how his own personal life also became a contributing factor in his discovery for the band. There were many tragic life events that seemed to mar Crouch's life at this point in time, which became crucial in him finding solace in the Dears album Gang of Losers, but most especially in the B-side release of People Like Us from the You and I Are a Gang of Losers EP. And Crouch explains, through his own personal history, his consumption of the song People Like Us created his own understanding and context of the song that is personal to himself, that within it, he identifies with what Lightburn is expressing in the song. It's overlaid with his own personal experiences, though. The song itself, which I regret to say I've struggled to find online, and thus I can only really interpret it through the lyrics that Crouch himself has provided in these liner notes. But the song itself seems to point to the finger at oppressors, explain how punched down minorities have become, in this case the black community. And this, though, becomes particularly interesting when Lightburn then points the finger within himself, saying, yes, I've done shit, I've been part of evil doing. And this here provides an enormous amount of context that changes, our understanding of the song. And it's a great example of how something little or small can change our understanding of art itself. Crouch goes on to explain that there was much healing to be found within that expression and admission of guilt. And that although he has been the victim of so much abuse in his life, where he'd been treated incredibly abhorrently, there have been occasions where he's been on the other end of that spectrum towards others. That although we are victims of so much in our life, sometimes we are also the oppressors. And it is important to acknowledge, learn, and grow from this understanding. Being the victim or traumatic experiences doesn't undo the horrible things you've done, but in turn, doing horrible things doesn't make you any less of a victim, I feel, is part of the point Crouch is trying to express here. It's interesting, it's very interesting. And yes, this self-reflection from Crouch comes across as a very powerful and emotive piece of context and understanding for the larger work itself. It adds so much to the album, especially in the final 2 tracks, which really makes so much sense with this background. The second track, I've Been Part of Evil Doing, directly references the Dears B-side track of People Like Us, which now possibly present it as a wordless understanding of his own transgressions towards other people, before he finally offers closure and the apology and forgiveness in the final track, Reconciliation. And here it feels like Crouch is attempting to offer a way of healing for himself, those he has hurt, and those who have hurt him. And yeah, I feel without this context, it feels like we're missing so much detail and understanding of the work itself, that it's not lost on me that by trying to read and understand everything involved with this album, it shaped my own understanding and interpretation of the work itself, in terms of how I perceive it, how I consume it, and how I'm gaining an understanding of it. That goes with my experiences and stuff. Jubilee, though, now comes across as this incredibly personal album that grapples with notions of understanding and interpretation to create a wholly unique experience for the wholly unique experience that draws from the sheer act of trying to understand it in the first place. And I feel that with that in mind, there's almost this meta element to it to some extent, that with the album being this chance to consider somebody's history and experiences. You can see how it's become interpreted, expressed through abstract art, how it's then consumed by us, and then shaped into our own understanding. There's, Crouch has really considered this and thought about this. And for me now, though, listening to this whole body of work, I get this incredibly cathartic release from the album, especially when it closes off with the finale of Reconciliation. And it feels like it's an album full of self-reflection, understanding, but more importantly, healing. That perhaps you as a listener may end up drawing something completely different from it. Maybe your own background, history, and experiences have led your life down a particular path with your own understanding of certain concepts, and that in turn is going to shape your own unique understanding of this record into something completely different. And as Crouch explained in the first paragraph, abstract art isn't great at communicating complex ideas. That we as listeners construct meaning to the works we consume. What we get out of it is what we get out of it. With all this, I do find myself returning to Jubilee so much more than I ever expected myself to do. I have to admit, when this was first released, I figured this was simply another Robert Crouch album that I'll dive into when I get the chance. And it's one of those things, I really regret not checking this out sooner though, because I find it to be an outstanding piece of artistic expression that just shakes me to my very core, both physically from that phenomenal low-end rumble in the first track, but also mentally from the cathartic holding and releasing of complex emotions. And reading the text, trying to understand, it had given me this sense of being pulled and released, as though I understand more, but also I understand less and less anyway. That, I believe also that my own impersonal interpretations are both meaningful, but also meaningless. It's a battle between two halves. That I even get this interpretation when looking at the artwork itself, that it's arguably a simple piece, a simple art piece, but I still find myself gazing into this thing. And to me, it feels like part of what Crouch was trying to express in the first paragraph, that without context, abstract art can be meaningless. So simply looking at this artwork, we're presented with an image of two men wrestling. But with the background surrounding the album itself though, our understanding of Robert Crouch himself, we get so much more viewing this album art. It's a battle between these two men, their different racial backgrounds, their expressions on their face. It opens so much to interpretation, which to me feels like an expression of Robert Crouch's background, his queer-coded biracial life that has led to many experiences throughout his whole lifetime. I just get it from looking at this album art, like there's this battle between two halves. And it's become one of my favourite album artworks in recent times because of that. It's, the whole album itself has cemented this deep place within my soul. I ponder about many elements of this album. A Ritual's original 2-hour improvised recording for starters, performed by Crouch in private for his partner Yann Novak. There's something very beautiful and mystifying about that. It makes me wonder what the original performance would have been like for Novak. A Ritual is peculiar and aggressive, yet there's something incredibly intimate about it. And, I wonder about that aggression that comes through on the recording and what it signifies, as well as the beauty of those closing tracks. I even wonder what is meant by the album title of Jubilee. A Jubilee is usually used to describe a special anniversary of an event. And I really wonder what Crouch is referencing here, especially with that title. What Jubilee does he mean? There's so many ways to interpret it after listening to this album and then viewing this album and looking at every part of it. But ultimately, this all seems like something only Crouch knows, that if we as consumers were meant to, perhaps it would have been touched upon in the lengthy album notes. For now, all we can really do is just make inherently flawed inferences and interpretations, and just let ourselves feel the emotions our bodies and mind naturally come up with when hearing this music. And so I feel this video has become incredibly obtuse and abstract for the most part. Certainly one of the longest video essays I've written on any piece of music in my lifetime. I'm not sure why I've been so drawn to this, but when, especially when interpreting art is somewhat meaningless and there's so much that we as consumers of media simply just don't know, and it makes it impossible. But I feel that Crouch wanted to generate discussion, open a platform for people to talk about their own lives, their own experiences, and share together in something incredibly special. As he said to Lawrence English, perhaps there might be an opportunity for something useful here. And I think with that, we're coming to the end of today's episode of Weird Music. This has been, I'm really glad to have talked about this album. This is something that's now become very special to me. I absolutely adore this album. Like, on a musical level, it just really fills me up with emotion. On an artistic level, I feel like Crouch has really pushed out something important to himself here. And yeah, it's a challenging release. It's difficult in some places, but it's incredibly beautiful. Like, what an album. And yeah, it generates a lot of discussion. There's been so much I've tried to talk about obtusely. Like, I'm sure I'm wrong about so many things on this, but just start a dialogue, start a discussion, talk about these things. With that though, I think we're going to call it the end of today's episode. I hope you've enjoyed this very long and obtuse episode of Weird Music. I hope you take care though. All the best to you, and bye bye for now. Bye bye.